Hello everybody and welcome to another video in this series on what to do in the first 5 minutes with an English literature anthology poetry question. Let's imagine your named poem is The Charge of the Light Brigade and this is the question. Compare how poets present ideas about war in Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade and one other poem. So the first thing to do is reread or scan through the named poem, pen in hand, and to annotate anything you think might be relevant to this question. So for The Charge of the Light Brigade, we might pick out how this poem is a ballad, a historic form of poetry which tells a story, and it contains a refrain, a phrase which is repeated regularly throughout the poem. In The Charge of the Light Brigade, the refrain is the use of 600 at the end of each stanza. Now, ballads tell important stories associated with histories, in other words, things we should never forget. And what shouldn't we forget in this poem? Well, to me, there are two distinct things: the soldiers' brave and noble sacrifice, and also how their suffering was ultimately unnecessary, as it was the result of a leadership error and could have been prevented. We might also pick out how most of the poem is written in clear dactylic dimeter. A dactyl is made up of one stressed syllable followed by two unstressed syllables, and if we break the poem up with the forward slashes you can see here, most of the poem is made up of two dactylic feet, and when there are 2 feet per line we call that a dimeter. So the poem is written largely in dactylic dimeter. Now, one of the lines that does not conform to dactylic dimeter is this one: someone had blundered. See how there's only one syllable after the stressed blun? The change in structure from the previous 3 lines emphasises the word blundered. But why? Tennyson read about the Charge of the Light Brigade in a newspaper report which said this: the British soldier will do his duty even to certain death and is not paralysed by feeling that he is the victim of some hideous blunder. So, through a change in the structure in this line, Tennyson is emphasising the blunder. He's criticising the unnecessary suffering brought about by the leadership error which led to this happening. He had to do it subtly because he was Poet Laureate, but it is there. Now, there is an obvious biblical reference, or Coolio reference, but we won't write about that in the exam, with the mention of the Valley of Death, an intertextual link to Psalm 23 which says, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." This biblical imagery highlights the awe-inspiring nature of the soldier's self-sacrifice. It's almost divine in the way we should respect it and what they did. So that rereading of the named poem will give me my concept. Now, let me just say here, if you're watching this thinking, well, I didn't know all that stuff, I do have long and shorter videos on every poem, so do check out the Power and Conflict revision playlist. So that rereading of the named poem will give me my concept. The Charge of the Light Brigade presents the idea that war contains unnecessary suffering and that those soldiers involved are worthy of great honour and respect. Now, with that in mind, I will then flick back to the list of poem titles which is provided in the question paper. Remember, you don't get the poems, but you do get a list of the titles, and I'll think through each title one by one, considering which poem to compare with that line of argument. And let me just point out, it's not that I'll now think, okay, is there another poem that uses the ballad form or religious language or dactylic dimeter? No, what I want to do is think about my second poem in terms of the idea that war contains unnecessary suffering despite the bravery of those involved. The June 2019 exam report pointed out that students who led their analysis through ideas in the poem rather than methods tended to do much better, so that's what I want to follow with this approach. So go through the list and think which compares well, and I think my best bet will be Exposure, a poem which focuses mostly on the seemingly unnecessary suffering of the soldiers who are enduring the merciless iced east winds despite the fact that ultimately nothing happens, and the unnecessary suffering is reflected in the structure of the poem. Each stanza begins with a blunt and powerful sentence. These opening sentences are then followed by highly emotive vocabulary choices, and crucially, after dramatically heightening the tension, each stanza ends with an anticlimax. And this 3-part structure is found in every stanza. Owen wants his reader to empathise with how the soldiers felt a sense of the pointlessness of war. Everything is tense and seemingly building up to a climax, only to end up with nothing happening. And yet the soldiers endure it because, since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn. So the fact that the soldiers face terrible conditions but stay committed to their duty highlights the respect and honour they deserve. Now obviously I won't have a copy of Exposure in front of me, so I'm going to need to remember quotations and references, but this now then is my concept and the brief introduction to my answer. Both the Charge of the Light Brigade and Exposure explore the idea that war contains unnecessary suffering and that the soldiers involved are worthy of great honour and respect. This then is a two-part line of argument. I'm going to perhaps spend the first half of my answer looking at the unnecessary suffering and the second half looking at how, even as a consequence of that unnecessary nature of their suffering, these soldiers deserve honour and respect. Everything in my answer then becomes part of the theory I'm exploring. Now, of course, I'm not saying this is how you would have to do it if a question came up about the Charge of the Light Brigade and ideas about war. All I'm trying to do is show you the sort of process you might go through for that first 5 minutes. If you have a different choice of second poem, put it in the comments section and explain your thinking.